Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is for All. This is episode 35, Honesty as it Relates to Discourse. And this is episode 35 of a series of ruminations that I do once a week. Basically, it's a series of collections of thoughts that I've had over the course of my time as an architect, a researcher, and draftsman. So basically, how did we get started? I started this on another platform, as I think I've said, and then basically from there, I found it was a kind of dissatisfying situation. So I came over to YouTube, and I found YouTube to actually be a better place. So the first 25 or so, I think 26 issues, I redid just to kind of create the consistency. And then after that, I've created now about 10 more. Anyway, so let's do a quick recap, not of all of them, but just basically this sense. The first one was called The Operation of the Metaphor. And that was important because the metaphor is basically a generative strategy. It's process-based kind of thinking that I've kind of come to adapt, but kind of discovered it as a result of what I can see as kind of like a natural process. So in the next 3 episodes, I talked about the organic metaphor, the artificial metaphor, and unbreakable bonds, or this proto-metaphor. Now, the reason I said that was, again, we understand the metaphor, most of us, through language and understand it as relates to art. But what I found was that I think that as I started to look into it, started to see it more as a kind of extension of the natural entanglement and engagement that exists in nature. So I said to myself that just the same way as let me use an analogy that like religious people feel that God is the process by which all moral things come about. In fact, the reality is the principles that they see and that they derive actually come from a natural base. So that these things are credited to someone, but in fact, they come from somewhere else. So in fact, our understanding of the what I call the artificial metaphor, which is that exists in language, it's actually kind of comes from that organic metaphor, which basically is that sense of things moving from simple to more complex by the way of the processes by which things go. Then the last one was the artificial metaphor, the unbreakable bond, which were basically a series of kind of stepping stones that kind of worked in terms of a sociological or kind of cultural circumstance. After that, I talked about the value and necessity of criticism and the art of finding what needs to be said, and a view of criticism as an indicator of societal health. So now I kind of added the idea of criticism as a valuable kind of component of dialogue within the realm of ideas, but I also kind of linked it back to the metaphor. And what I did was understand the fact that this unbreakable bond, this proto-metaphor in terms of like criticism and its value, was something that we had kind of established, and that it was something that showed a little bit of concern in the fact that it kind of had been worn out fairly dramatically. And what we saw was the fact that criticism had not been maintained. And in fact, in my time, I'd watched criticism go from a kind of harsh term to actually now a kind of insulting term, and it's kind of something that's kind of somewhat under siege, which to me is very troubling, because I feel as if the most gracious, cordial, and considerate thing that an individual can do is find what needs to be said. And I find that we live in a society where people are more likely to want to hear something that would be a lie than to understand what the truth is of any particular circumstance. So I find that one of the things that I've said in my life is the fact that it's more important to find and say what needs to be said in any particular circumstance than basically tell someone what they want to hear. So then we kind of went from there to specific short rundown of architecture in general. I talked about architecture as a verb, as a process, or a series of processes. And then I talked about drawing and towards an organic architecture. So I laid out some of the kind of things that existed in terms of my own particular idiom. Then what we did was we went from there to a series of things where we talked about kind of more kind of idea-based things for a while, and talk about some of the kind of formulations of things in terms of how I got past, from those things, other things that kind of led me to particular place. So I talked about authority and ideas, which was kind of somewhat not different than what we're going to talk about tonight. And then I talked about my past architecture, which was basically my youth, talked about my recent past architecture, which was my school and being a professor. And then I talked about the aftermath, which was organic design thinking, which we're going to be talking about in more detail in the coming weeks. Then we went back to the idea of indicators of societal health, and we kind of talked again more about like the proto-metaphor, and then emotional attachments to ideas, understanding and judgments. What is an unbreakable bond? What is the important unbreakable bonds? And what are important unbreakable bonds, and the importance of unbreakable bonds? From there, we talked briefly about force, power, rule, and persuasion, which also relates directly to this, because there'll be some kind of correlations again to works of Ortega Gasset and Alfred North Whitehead. I mentioned Whitehead and I mentioned Gasset frequently because these were probably, along with Hume and Darwin, the most influential thinkers on my particular journey through this world. I feel as if Darwin's Origin of Species was probably the most important book that's ever been written. And I feel as if it made sense of a major achievement in understanding the fact that the plasticity of organism was a concept that we had to basically come to comprehend as indisputable. And I think we're still seeing that we're trying to absorb this idea. And I think its brilliance is something that we struggle with more morally than intellectually. But that is something that's just my opinion. From there, I returned to tradition and culture, and I talked about the idea of suicide as a way in which we understand the difference between simple persistence and conditions on that persistence, and that at a certain point we understand the fact that there are reasons why we would want to make something more valuable than life itself, and that there are conditions on which we would put life. And I said the first great invention probably was suicide, because it was the first time where an individual made the choice that there were conditions under which they would not sustain or continue. Now, I believe that's also a very important point, given the tremendous social liberties that exist in my country, in the United States, in the fact that there is this idea that the body is your sovereign territory, just the same way that the things that happen or you do to your body are not regulated by the laws outside your body. So the fact is, like, just the same way that an embassy for another country can exist on the territory of a certain country, its rules do not abide. The moment that I go into the Italian embassy in New York City, I'm now in Italy. I'm no longer in the United States. So your body is basically your sovereign territory. And I think that idea is that regardless of what the law is, right, outside, those things that concern your body basically are yours. So anyway, we went through that. And then we kind of talked about the kind of like the move towards civilization that was talked about in Adventures of Ideas, which is probably a book that I've been kind of somewhat obsessed with for the last 2 years. I mean, my first connection with Whitehead was through the Aims of Education, and I thought that was a brilliant article. I thought the series of essays were kind of like just fantastic and transforming. And then when I started to understand more about Whitehead, I tried to read Process and Reality, which of course is impossible, but I can maybe know the basics, right? But then I found that Adventures of Ideas was kind of like a shorthand for process and reality, and at least to a certain degree, I came to kind of understand certain concepts within that. So that leads us to the ideas of truth, beauty, love, and then the correlation of truth and beauty underneath love, which was a construction that I made based on the principle of kind of like, kind of the indispensability from Ortega. From that, I went to, that was the kind of like the last of those particular kind of essays, the ones that I kind of had in the original one. And then this time we went from there and started to kind of have new ones. I talked about more in terms of the specifics of my work, which will continue, which was in what I called entanglement and conditioning, which was what I would call the organic, or the organic aspect of my work, or the organisms. And then I talked about measurement, which basically is kind of the kind of earlier, kind of more derivative work of mine, and what I would call the inorganic, or the mechanisms. Then I talked about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. I talked about understanding and judgment as regards authority, the unbreakable bond of freedom and tolerance, and then value and consequence, entanglement and conditioning. Again, we talked about conditioning, and that was the second part, right? Because I think that the conditioning and entanglement were kind of very important ideas. I'll be talking more about that because within the next couple of weeks, we'll be going into more of the actual kind of underpinning of the work of the architecture itself. So last week, we talked about the critique of the present non-organic architecture. And, for my own reasons, I haven't gone into my own personal feelings about the failure or the fetish of the fact that architecture kind of probably since the 1960s has been a kind of fairly uninspiring, unprovocative endeavor. I have my personal feelings about the reasons what that is, but I don't think that's much more important in terms of the critique of the circumstance and the potential solutions. So after this week, we're going to be talking about honesty as it relates to discourse. And next week, we're going to talk about a very important topic that we put off for too long, which is the loss of 2D design. And then from that, we're going to go into an American architecture. Because I think that rather than go into the details of the kind of rather nefarious and kind of somewhat divisive realities that have kind of held us back for, let's see, the last 50 years, let's kind of go past that in terms of what the potentials are. Because I think as the influence of that prior time is waning, I'd rather kind of focus on the fact that there is actually a potential, and there's some interesting ideas that are starting to form. And I feel as if some of the things that I said when I was a professor back in the 1980s may in fact kind of be starting to come to fruition. So anyway, a kind of quick overview is the fact that I believe that there is a reason for why things relate to honesty, and that there's a certain integrity that is necessary to have within discourse for it to kind of play the purpose that it needs to be. And I'll start by saying that one of the things that I think, and as I wrote this down because it was within Whitehead, and I kind of put this together as an unbreakable bond, is that there was a point when the strain of character necessary for preservation linked itself to what he called intelligent self-interest. I'll read the actual phrase after the next part, but what I wanted to just say was that intelligent self-interest was actually that kind of idea where persuasion started to kind of introduce itself over force. And that we started to understand that intelligent self-interest was an actually very valuable kind of concept, in the fact that it was something that would kind of lead towards a kind of like advent of civility. So anyway, with that said, let's kind of see what is happening on what we call our most important segment, which is called This Week in Julie. So, Huddle, what is going on in This Week in Julie? Come and say hi. Then you can go get your drawing. What's going on in this
Hello.
week in Julie?
Well, I made lots of strides on my drawing. My drawing is actually visualizing the activity, which is basically wreaking havoc in the human body, visualizing the activity of something called a retrotransposon, which is ancient DNA that we all possess inside ourselves, which harks back to not M for a million, B for a billion, 4 billion years old. We have something called line 1 retrotransposons, and line 1 are the 100 copies, the most damaging, the ones that have survived till today. Picture something incredibly atavistic and incredibly injurious that's lurking around in your system and jumping around like a cane toad, something that, again, is an invasive species. This is like having an invasive species living inside all of us that is awakened all the time and hops around very unexpectedly, causing autoimmune malfunction, diseases like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. It's been linked to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, various cancers. Uh, it's really nasty stuff. It's fascinating, though, because it is DNA that transforms into RNA back to a form of DNA, which then is posing in a masquerade as current DNA. And it literally opens up your DNA strands, scissors them open, inserts itself in, and goes to work. So it's quite something. Let me get my drawing here.
All right. Well, I'll ask you some questions while you're kind of getting that. So, is it possible that, as an analogy, there's a kind of similarity to kind of like
I've got my drawing.
a kind of like a lateral gene transfer?
A lateral or horizontal gene
Right.
transfer. Yes,
Okay.
there is.
So-
there are
So it's
similarities.
as if suddenly these kind of like remnants that come from times where we were bacteria or we were microbes or we were kind of like, like back in our lineage, now kind of reinsert themselves in a place where they kind of like no longer have not only a useful purpose, but they become kind of adversarial.
Yeah, they don't really have a useful purpose.
No, because I mean we're not in a position where we would necessarily want to become those prior steps that kind of come through our lineage.
Right.
I mean, it's like these things are kind of things that we've discarded because they were no longer kind of fruitful or beneficial.
Yes, also the body interprets them as a virus or viruses plural. In fact, they have the ability, which is rather remarkable, the retrotransposons, also known as jumping genes, because they're our genetic material that leaps around like a bullfrog. I mean, except bullfrogs don't do damage. The cane toad was introduced to Australia, unfortunately, by people who really didn't think it through in any way, shape, or form. And the cane toad is this enormous, incredibly toxic toad. Its pores ooze fatal toxins that will kill anything it touches. I mean, if people handle them, they have to wear gloves. Animals that eat them die. They come into contact with plants, and the plants die. They poison the food chain. Animals that eat them that are then eaten in turn by other animals die. So they are incredible. They're huge. They're ornery. They reproduce incredibly fast. They were brought in to eradicate the cane beetle. Now there are many better ways to eradicate a cane beetle. Without bringing in a predator that has no predators itself. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Explain how that's operating in the drawing. Explain
Okay.
what we're doing here so we're illustrating this idea. Because you're
Sure.
talking about this invasive circumstance that basically becomes a destructive force. So
Yeah.
explain how that's being illustrated here in the painting.
Okay. What I've done in my drawing here is I have chosen an object at the Met. This is a Christopher Dresser vase. And Christopher Dresser was a brilliant British designer of textiles, of objects, of silver objects, of porcelain objects, of furniture, of interiors. He really altered the face of a design, and his works are still in use and they still look futuristic. This is an enameled porcelain vase with gold leaf on it, with a very abstract pattern, a very reminiscent of Chinese characters. And there's a way to get that without as much glare. And you want me to hold part of it?
No.
Or you think? So on this vase, I was particularly searching through areas of the Met. There's a German Cabinet of Curiosities area, works from the Renaissance, trying to find a piece that it was reflective of the idea of something that did not belong someplace, that was causing a disruption, that was literally making the very structure of the piece crumble or be rearranged in a non-functional way, which is what's happening. So this vase actually has an owl cabochon in this area, and the owl very much, I mean, it's very quirky, but the owl looked like something that was imposed on the vase, didn't necessarily belong as part of the vase. And I took this kind of very charming little cabochon of an owl and replaced this with this enormous face of a cane toad. And that is what they look like. They grimace, they have big, bulgy, suppurating lips. They have huge eyes, they're warty, they're fierce, they're very ill-tempered. I left out the lower lip on purpose because I believe that the character of the cane toad is very obvious from what I've chosen to both draw. And I think that the mark of an excellent drawing is also choosing what not to draw. People don't really talk about that. What does one leave out of a piece intentionally? Not to overdraw everything. And it's not a matter of not putting in the detail. It's a matter of discernment, of choosing, of paring down in a graphically arresting way that which is necessary, that which makes the most impact, that which is the best communicator of the information. And the information is they are voracious. So the bottom jaw drops away for the reflections on the enamel of the vase. And in fact, there's quite a lot of pattern there, but the cane toad, as the cane toad that has displaced the pattern. They displace everything. They wreck the ecosystem. I mean, plants, animals, insects, birds are fallen. I mean, and they have multiplied. I don't know what the current count is. I can look it up, but it's boggling. So at the bottom is a cane toad that is lurking in the abstract shapes, the Chinese characters at the bottom of the vase. But what has actually happened is I have drawn them. I have in my mind's eye lifted them off the surface of the vase. They've been broken apart. They've been mangled. They've been twisted like very elegant Wiener Werkstatt wreckage. So there's an area here where they are are very, very flattened, and the vase is broken apart. They wrap around the outside of the vase. The ornament falls away, and the cane toad is, as the cane toad does, as retrotransposons, known as jumping genes, do. They displace. They surmount, they rewrite our genetic code, and they impose their will, and their will is never beneficial in both of the cases.
Well, I think it's interesting because what happens is these pieces of these remnants are kind of like left around, and they kind of don't get thrown out. They're just there. So as a result, they're kind of like these vestigial things that were once valuable, but now they're not only kind of like they kind of insert themselves and actually do damage. Because there was a term used before that kind of slipped my mind. I should have mentioned it, about the idea of kind of like the insertion, where it actually causes this hardship, this circumstantial hardship. And it's something where, there's this anachronistic anomaly that now is trying to kind of like rewrite itself back into relevance.
Yeah.
And by doing that, it causes this damage. So as a result, it's kind of like reintroducing something that is not only not, that's so anachronistic that it couldn't possibly find its way, but in the kind of process, it just kind of like dealing with the delicacy and intricacy of the genetic material, it just kind of pulls a lot of things and causes a lot of trouble. It's kind of like trying to have a piece of a material kind of reinsert itself in a place where it doesn't belong, like a third leg or kind of like something like that. It doesn't really improve the ability to walk. It actually just kind of becomes a hindrance.
But it does it surgically, which is what's so impressive and so terrifying here, is that's where it differs from the cane toad, which is not a surgical strike. I mean, the cane toad is a berserker. It's a marauder. It's not thinking from 1 minute to the next of an elegant but a destructive shift. In the case of retrotransposons, they're very elegant, and they are incredibly surgical in what they do. But what they do happens to have a vehemently, ripping effect on the body. So
no, it's true. And I mean, I think that it's kind of since I've heard the term, which now must be going back like 3 to 5 years, when it's become such a discussed item within the terms of science. I mean, we came across it again, like we do everything else from Science Magazine.
Yeah.
But the idea of lateral gene transfer, then I kind of found that like Lynn Margulis had talked about this, in symbiogenesis, and like, the fact that it goes back quite a way, where the idea of the tree of life in the larger organisms is the way that most people understand the biological idea of the difference between clades and lineages. But the clades and lineages exist in the animal kingdom are kind of very different than what we see in microorganisms. And in fact, in microorganisms, lineages and clades are becoming very difficult, if almost impossible, to discern. It's almost as if like there's a different code or system that exists because of lateral gene transfer, or these kind of jumping genes, where we can't see in a situation where we have a clade where there's a point where two things diverge from a common ancestor. The idea is it's almost impossible when you look back at lineages in the kind of smaller organisms,
it's not
where you can't see lineages, because the idea is some of the these things have really jumped around. I mean, there's almost like a similarity in the fact that, like, we look at the fact that I kind of remember, calculus dealt with two things. It dealt with kind of like, the very, very big and the very, very small. And there seemed to be a kind of like, not an inversion, but a kind of a difference. But then when you go to physics, we kind of seem to be struggling with the fact that things that happened in the large scale are very different than things that happen at the very small scale. And it almost seems as if, almost like it makes sense. The more I look at it, when I see these things, it makes sense that these things are different. But in fact, the thing is we find lack of evidence for lateral gene transfer in larger organisms, but in fact, I would say retrotransposons kind of project this idea of the fact that maybe one, that there does exist the idea of lateral gene transfer in larger organisms outside of kind of microbes and bacteria, as well as the fact that maybe the fact that it's not more prevalent is because it's not a beneficial thing, right? I mean, we look at so anyway.
I think I'd like to weigh in on something which harks right to your topic of the night. Did you bring it up? Your topic?
Yeah, that's the first thing I say.
Okay.
You should listen.
I'm sorry.
Never listen. Never listen.
I do. I was preparing.
I know.
Anyway, you probably don't know about this, but there's a discovery I'd like to introduce everybody to that is rather earth-shattering in microbiology, which is one of my pets.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it harks to a deleterious form of horizontal gene transfer. Now, most horizontal gene transfer, as we knew it, was advantageous. In fact, it didn't harm the neighboring organism, especially at a microscopic level, or so he thought.
Mm-hmm.
It was advantageous, meaning when the really nasty infections that people get in the hospital, which is why, unless you absolutely have to be in a hospital, don't go. Those acquired infections are the result, in a lot of cases, of very rapid adaptation within 1 or 2 generations of horizontal gene transfer, making superbugs, basically a bacterial strain that takes what it needs from its neighbors that might have certain characteristics that it lacks in order not just to survive. This is not for basic survival. It's to acquire pretty much the equivalent of superpowers, things that maybe it couldn't do, but its neighbors can, which become quantitatively important. However, a new form of horizontal gene transfer has been discovered.
I got soul and I'm superbug.
Yeah, it's called T6SS. And this is scary as all hell, but I will share with you all. Type 6 secretion system, T6SS. This is bacteria that kill and eat their neighbors. And
I've done that.
Yeah, I know. That's why we're here. So what they do is they inject a molecular needle. I say that again because it's hard to fathom. They inject a molecular needle into the neighboring cells, and they suck the life out of them like vampires. And they don't wait for them to recover because they don't. Then all of the nutrients, the body of the cell, basically, if it were a person, all their organs and all their guts that spill out into the surrounding area is eaten when it is released. So anything that they haven't siphoned out, they will eat because the cell walls will collapse. Now, this does not go over well evolutionarily speaking because it's unsustainable. If you kill and eat enough of your neighbors, you don't have any neighbors left, which makes for nice, quiet reading rooms and a lot of room at the restaurants. And you don't have to wait online at the drugstore. But it's not sustainable because then you shift the balance of predator and prey to the point where you have mostly predators and not a lot of prey. But this is a form of horizontal gene transfer where they acquire not just the characteristics of their neighboring cells, they literally suck the life out of them, and they are nutrients, and they get really powerful, really big, really strong, really
I suspect when the aliens come down finally.
They're already here.
I don't think so. If they were, they would basically they would harvest us for something. But
You
I
have
see.
3 antennae.
I used to have 5.
It's too bad.
Yeah, well, I lost 2 on this secret space laser. They got tangled in the thing.
Mhm.
Anyway, but then they'll kind of like, I always love those things where kind of like they kind of take humans and they kind of harvest us.
That's really funny.
Yeah, good
I
times.
don't think they would actually bother.
No, I think we might. I mean, again, we kind of take our intelligence very seriously, but in fact,
They
like,
probably.
I think that they probably would see us the way we see chickens, or kind of like,
Or krill.
yeah, and they would kind of harvest us for some kind of processed calcium or hydrogen or something like that.
Krill burgers.
Krill burgers, yeah. Anyway, so now on to the topic. Honesty as relates to discourse. So let me start off with 2 things that I think are very important. I've spoken about this before. Okay. And then come back because I want you to kind of like, I want to hear your thoughts about this. Reading in Who Rules in the World, chapter 14 of Ortega Gasset's Revolt of the Masses, which I wish was not as prescient as it has turned out to be, where he says, this stable, normal relation amongst men, which is known as rule, never rests on force. On the contrary, it is because a man or group of men exercise command that they have at their disposition that social apparatus or machinery known as force. The cases in which at first glance force seems to be the basis of command are revealed on a closer inspection as the best example to prove our thesis. Napoleon led an aggressive force against Spain, maintained his aggression for a time, but properly speaking, never ruled in Spain for a single day, and that although he had the force, and precisely because he had it, it is necessary to distinguish between a process of aggression and a state of rule. And we talked about the difference between force and persuasion. And that was something that I think has to deal with this topic. What I think happens is, and this was a kind of like one of the kind of unbreakable bonds, was something that I saw as an idea where I said that the idea that I kind of had in the sense of the strain of character necessary for preservation was linked with intelligent self-interest. So let me go to that piece in Force and Persuasion in Adventures of Ideas. Need to get another copy. This one's like really beaten up. But I mean, it kind of like, it's not as beaten up as, again, I'm not hard on books. It's just that I find there's a piece, I think, at the very beginning of The Aims of Education, where one of the things that Whitehead says is, teach few things, but teach them in all their intricacy. So then try to get every possible combination so that you kind of get a depth of perspective and kind of potential, rather than teaching a lot of, things. So I kind of like have a few basic premises. And I think for me, I kind of feel as if that's been the case. I've read widely, I believe, for a person as an architect, but at the same time, I feel that there's certain books that I always kind of come back to. I love to read literature. I kind of love Borges. I love Kafka. I love Maeterlinck. I love the Double Garden. I mean, but the thing is, there are certain things. Well, I mean, I'll go back to the Double Garden a lot. I mean, I just find that is just such an incredible book. Anyway, so reading here. All right, this was.
What are you reading?
Okay, so the first thing I'm reading is a piece. These are both from Force and Persuasion. At the close of the Dark Ages, Europe started upon its second effort after civilization with these main advantages: its Christian ethics, its instinct for legal organization, transcending local boundaries derived from the church, and the reminiscence of the empire. And thirdly, its wider inheritance of antecedent thought gradually disclosing itself as Hebrew, Greek, and Roman literatures. The total effect was the increased sense of some dignity of man as man. There has been growth, slow and wavering, of respect for the preciousness of human life. This is the humanitarian spirit, gradually emerging in the slow sunrise of 1,000 years. The creation of the world, said Plato, is the victory of persuasion over force. The worth of man consists in their liability to persuasion. They can persuade and can be persuaded by the disclosure of alternatives, the better and the worse. Civilization is the maintenance of social order by its own inherent persuasiveness to embodying the nobler alternative. The recourse to force, however, unavoidable, is a disclosure of the failure of civilization. So this, what Ortega said, and the piece that I'm going to read now, kind of reiterate these same basic premises. Indeed, the ferocity may have been the later development due to the increase of intelligent self-interest. It may easily have arisen as a strain of character necessary for preservation and have developed into an overgrowth checking upward evolution beyond a low level of life. We find civilized communities struggling with the two kinds of compulsion. There are the natural necessities such as food, warmth, and shelter. There are also necessities for coordination to the social activities. This coordination is produced partly by instinctive habit, sustained by flashes of good sense, partly by the compulsion exercised by other members of the community, and partly by reasonable persuasion. Now, we see the fact that persuasion and force are two components that we have swapped out of our relationship for preservation, right? We see the fact that we have, just like we spoke about, there's a strong analogy. And when we talked about the idea of that we had technology in previous times linked to superstition or religion or other non-rational factors, as opposed to now when it's basically related to reason or science. So our technology advances and is more efficient and can progress quicker and more effectively because our technique is related to science, and our technology is related to science. Our technique is related to these reason-based systems. Mm-hmm. So therefore, there are advantages like the ability to kind of predict certain things, to anticipate certain things, to make certain tests, to be able to have certain factors in which you can judge the efficiency and effectiveness of certain improvements, the ability to make improvements, and to be able to understand what those improvements are. This is a tremendous advantage over the idea that if we just simply sacrifice enough virgins will get rain, which to kind of revert to that would be just absolutely absurd. It's the idea of basically uncoupling an unbreakable bond and basically going backwards. Now, by unbreakable bond, the term that I invented to use for unbreakable bonds, it doesn't mean that they can't be uncoupled or decoupled, but that they should as other things happen. So the idea is we uncoupled the unbreakable bond between technique and superstition, and because we found a better alternative, which was technique and reason. So in this case, persuasion actually kind of is the thing that allows us, or has allowed us, to see the benefit of civilization as a result of the previous, right, which was force. Mm-hmm. So when I wrote some things down when I was on the train, which I kind of was talking to Julie about. And in fact, what was interesting was when in this chapter, on force of persuasion, Whitehead talks about commerce, and he talks about the idea of value. Now, we've talked about value. The idea that something can have a kind of desire to be sought after by individuals, right, is a psychological idea that is the result of universal desire. So, intelligent self interest. What I think we realize is that deepening what we want to do, right, in terms of relates to discourse, is we want to deepen our understanding as opposed to simply changing opinions. That we want to enable freedom of thought over the control or the desire for control of others. Deepen our understanding rather than a coercion for control, right? And what we realized is, and like we talked about this, was there were certain common subterfugal or common avenues of subterfuge. And Julie, you had some things that you kind of wanted to say in terms of that because we talked about that. So give us an idea, like what you thought were some of the more nefarious or kind of like insidious kind of avenues of that.
Well, say on a professional level, when you should be addressing somebody's work, their concerns, like say you're at a critique in art school, a jury critique at an architecture school. Say you're at a planning meeting, urban planning and engineering meeting. One method that humans use all the time are personal attacks, which have no place ever, but they certainly don't have a place in a professional environment. And often people use personal attacks as a way to undermine their colleagues, which I think is one of the lowest forms of subterfuge. And that's what cowards do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're afraid of another person's ideas and you're an alpha like we are, you will go toe to toe. You'll have a discourse with them if you actually have a leg to stand on, or in our case, a tripod, three legs to stand on. But you will be able to reason your argument. You will be able to engage in an eloquent debate. Most people can't even speak an eloquent sentence or write one now.
Mm-hmm.
So they not only can't engage in a debate or expound upon their ideas or manifest their own thoughts in writing or verbally. So what they'll do is they will use their low form of subterfuge by making personal attacks. And we've seen this over and over and over again in multiple supposedly professional settings.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to give one of your examples?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens is that I've seen this back in the 80s, late 80s into the 90s in academia. And what I found was the academic environment that I remember and that I was brought up in, and I kind of think that we both kind of understand this was like the last great age of the academy, was what I considered an incredibly healthy environment that was led by the ideas. And what I mean is, like, discourse was not about proving the other person wrong or proving yourself right or kind of gaining power or kind of that. Your authority was not your desire. It was simply the cumulative effort of your effort.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, an individual became sought after because of his ability to consistently be compelling and consequential as regards the topics at hand. So as a result, you had this incredibly healthy environment where not only were you were looking to deepen the understanding and be provocative in terms of the questions you asked, rather than basically kind of having a kind of like, he said, no, she said, kind of that we see a lot of times in social media. What I found was the problem was when the academy became coercive, and that the deans and the administrators took over and started to create what they called policy. Ideas were no longer what moved the university. Ideas are what you have moved the university, have moved academia, have moved ideas, and have generated that part of civilization that has come from the academy. That no longer happens because now they are simply just policy institutes. Scientists have become kind of like technical service workers. They're not great thinkers. The philosophers are basically just kind of like mercenaries. So, what happened was policy started to dictate the fact that the individual of a provocative nature, the leading academics, were now under siege. And what I saw was, interestingly, people who were the people who had been kind of reluctant to kind of join in any kind of particular group, but who, led by the nature of their ideas, the great minds of our times or any times, basically stayed true to their ideas and were kind of like found politics and policy kind of like just baseless and pedestrian and boorish. So they were for a short time they were able to stay kind of like aloof, but eventually they became the targets because these were powerful individuals who refused to take positions. Their positions were their own. So as a result, they became the targets of the policymakers. And interestingly, in the first or second generations that I experienced in kind of like the late 70s, early 80s, late 80s, those first iterations of this, horrible kind of like ethnic cleansing of genius, was something that younger professors who are now coming to tenure or kind of finishing their careers now speak of this terrible, terrible kind of situation that they think is just starting to take, root in the academy today. But in fact, they were the first beneficiaries of it because they were there and sat quiet and were willing to take the career advancement by watching the witch hunt of the great professors, the brilliant professors, the genius professors who were ostracized.
Because it served
their purpose. Needs. Exactly. In fact, I remember a really horrible parallel, which was, when German doctors in the Nazi era talked about the fact that, well, why would we stop, the hospitals and the research facilities, getting rid of the Jewish doctors? We could advance. So these people who kind of like, in fact, we have a person, we won't mention her name, who I used to see as an example of, she was always the one who, after somebody, no, she would always kind of find a way to rationalize when someone of merit had kind of been, they had found a way to kind of rid the institution of this person. Would always kind of be the first person to rationalize, like, oh, well, they never really wore brown shoes. They were always a black shoe person. And, we're a brown shoe institution. And I'm like, and I remember telling her, I said, you know what? You will probably be the first person to kind of call foul when this happens to you. But because she was a young professor and she was kind of going along, and she felt that she was safe, she didn't anticipate the fickleness of mediocre minds.
And there's her mistake.
And there was her mistake. So when it came for her, that was exactly what happens. Like, I can't believe they did this.
And
like, how can we allow this? It's like, exactly. And we know that idea. So the idea is we should stand behind integrity, stand in front of integrity, stand proudly side by side with integrity, and be honored to be there. But we watch this disappear. And what happens is now honesty as relates to discourse in terms of what we've talked about in the kind of previous things we've spoken of, were those things that allowed for this ability. Now, one of the other benefits of having a healthy academic society is that, and we saw this tonight, we were listening to some people talk, and what happens is the concept, the topic at hand that is being looked at and being discerned and items are being provoked and consequences being uncovered, and is that individuals were reticent to just talk gibberish. You just knew not only was it disrespectful, it was absurd. So the idea of kind of bringing in some kind of divisive or kind of like insubstantial or kind of inconsequential nonsense was always going to be swept away. But now, since there is no debate of consequences, there is no discussion of consequence, right? All kinds of gibberish is just tossed around. And what you have is this clatter and clamor of kind of nonsense. And like we talked about recently, when we talked about the difference between kind of like judgment and understanding. And it's because we have suspended honesty in discourse. We no longer engage honestly and in good faith. I hate using that term because it's a common term. We no longer have integrity, sincerity, and honesty. Persuasion existed as a result of consequence to serve that intelligent self-interest. But without that honesty, intelligent self-interest gets subverted and it becomes authoritarian, it becomes coercive, and it becomes ultimately feral and force. That to me is the fear that I have at the moment, that thing which is the rudder on the ship of the realm of ideas is either being dismantled, has been dismantled, and cannot be repaired. So the point is the ship rudderless? Can the ship be repaired? Are we capable of repairing the ship? This is grim, but this is the circumstance.
Pretty grim, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, am I incorrect?
No, I didn't say that.
No, I know. All right. So anyway, so let's conclude
on that joyful note.
Yeah. So anyway, but
everyone's jumping out the window now.
No, actually, most people tell me that I'm a liar and that basically I'm kind of some kind of sentimentalist.
It
says 3. I think that's 3. Don't know. Maybe that's people speaking.
It says 3.
3. I know. A lot of things say 3.
No.
Now, look. Wait. 3. It says 23. All right. So
it actually said 1. Now it says 3.
Okay, it's possible. It can happen.
Okay.
Anyway, so next week, right, we are going to talk about the loss of 2D design, and I can't wait because Julie is the actual expert of that discussion. It's something we've talked about for years, and I can't wait to hear. In fact, you'll be running next week because I want to listen to you do it because this is something we need to speak of. Anyway, so the loss of 2D design, and then we're going to talk about an American architecture, which is following up from and as relates to a true organic impulse. So anyway, last thoughts.
Well,
again, we want to stay under an hour, so
we can invent an entity or invent a method to set us back on the right course. I think that's what that's our mandate.
Exactly. So in closing, next week we're going to talk about the loss of 2D design and then an American architecture and then our favorite organic impulse. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.